Um, my name is Nicholas Karides, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Hellenic-American Cultural Foundation to another one of our virtual events. As you may know, the foundation was organized 9 years ago to promote high quality and relevant educational and cultural programs events for persons interested in the rich history and legacy of Greece. Our goal is to remain relevant and inspirational even during a pandemic, and we will continue to find ways and different media to reach out to our audience and the community. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have with us Professor Barry Strauss. He's a renowned expert in ancient and military history who has published extensively and whose numerous award-winning books have been translated into 15 languages. Also, it is only appropriate that this foundation event takes place on the 2500th anniversary of the Battle of Salamis. Before we begin, I do want to thank a few people who made this event possible. First, we want to thank Robert Shaw, Vice Chairman of the Foundation's board, who suggested this exciting program and helped put the event together. He will introduce Professor Strauss and moderate the questions and of the presentation. We also want to thank Peter Bezos, the Foundation's treasurer, who was involved extensively in the logistics and technical matters for this evening, and Jacob Peters, the Foundation's tech consultant, who has been instrumental in helping with the operational and structural issues of tonight's event. And now let me ask Robert to introduce Professor Strauss.
Thank you, Nick. We are indeed fortunate to have Barry Strauss with us here this evening. Barry is, in addition to being an ancient historian focusing on military history of ancient Greece and Rome in particular, is also himself an accomplished rower and has written about rowing. And so he speaks with great authority on some of the technical aspects of the Battle of Salamis. And I'm sure you're going to find his talk very interesting from many standpoints. What Nick said about the event being timely is certainly true. We are literally at this moment between the 2500th anniversaries of the Battle of Thermopylae and the Battle of Salamis. Salamis took place in 480 BC, I think on September 25. So we are only 9 days away from the exact 2500th anniversary of the battle. Barry is a military historian, as I said, with a focus on Rome. He is the Bryce and Edith Bomar Professor in Humanistic Studies at Cornell. His books have been translated into 15 languages. His latest book, 10 Caesars, Roman Emperors from Augustus to Constantine, has been hailed as a superb summation of 4 centuries of Roman history. That was a comment made by the Wall Street Journal. And I can attest to it being a great book. I read it earlier this year. His Battle of Salamis, the naval encounter that saved Greece and Western civilization, on which he'll be speaking this evening, was named one of the best books of 2004 by the Washington Post. He's written also and been published on Alexander, Hamilton, Caesar, and the Genius of Leadership, and is currently writing a book on the Battle of Actium, the war that made the Roman Empire, Antony, Cleopatra, and Octavian, that will appear in August 2021. His podcast, Antiquitas, Leaders and Legends of the Ancient World, is available on most major platforms, as well as on his website, barrystrauss.com, Strauss with 2 S's. In 2019-20, he was Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Naval Postgraduate School and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. In recognition of his scholarship, he was named an honorary citizen of Salamis, Greece. I think for all of us, Salamis, regardless of whether we're of Greek heritage, transcends a narrow point of Greek interest. certainly when I was growing up as a schoolboy in England, we were taught about Salamis, Marathon, Salamis and Plataea, as though they were battles almost won by the British, because they were viewed as such essential and fundamental battles in the survival and the development of a Western civilization. And we had to learn by heart Byron's poem, The Isles of Greece, from Don Juan, including the verse about the Battle of Salamis. So it's all very stirring stuff, and I'm sure that you won't be disappointed by the talk tonight. Barry, we look forward to hearing what you have to say. And at the end, there will be an opportunity for you to questions in writing, and I will then read them to Barry. I'll read, depending on the number of questions we get, there will be perhaps a need to be selective. So welcome, Barry, and thank you for agreeing to talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Hellenic-American Cultural Foundation. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I couldn't be happier to have this opportunity to talk about the Battle of Salamis, which is near and dear to my heart, and I hope I can make it near and dear to yours. So to begin with, I'd like to be able to share my screen. I'd like to be able to share my screen. So let me just bear with me for a second. Okay, we're going to go to slideshow. Excellent. The Battle of Salamis, September 480 BC. As Robert said, it took place around the autumnal equinox, perhaps on September 25th. A stirring event. And in this 19th century German painting, maybe a little bit over the top, we see the battle in all its drama. And dramatic it was indeed, because the Battle of Salamis the Battle of Salamis saved Greece. If the Greeks had not won at Salamis, it would have been possible for the Persians to succeed in their attempt to invade and conquer Greece. And if that had happened, democracy might have been strangled in its cradle, with incalculable consequences for the history of civilization. So how did we get here? How did the battle happen? That's what I want to take you through this evening. First, a little bit of chronology. So as you can see, the battle took place in 480 BC, when the Persians, led by their king, Xerxes, had invaded Greece. And as Robert said, at the end of August, there was the Battle of Thermopylae, more on that in a moment. And then at the end of September, the Battle of Salamis. It was a war that was part of hundreds of years of conflict between these two great peoples, the Persians and the Greeks, beginning when Cyrus the Great became a king of Persia and founded the Persian Empire in the middle of the 6th century BC, and ending, at least for a time, when Alexander of Macedon conquered the Persian Empire late in the 4th century BC. We'll talk more about these dates in a moment. So here is the Persian Empire in 490 BC. As you can see, it was a great empire extending around over about 3,000 miles from what is today the Indo-Pakistani border and Central Asia, all the way westward, Sea of Marmara, to the far side of that, and the far side of the Black Sea, and in the south to Egypt and Libya. In 499 BC, the Greek inhabitants of the western coast of Anatolia had revolted. And the small Greek city-state of Athens had sent a contingent across the Aegean Sea to help them. And together they had marched inland to the Persian provincial capital of Sardis and burned a temple there, the Temple of Artemis, before they beat a hasty retreat. The Persians ultimately succeeded in putting down this rebellion and then decided they needed to put down the Athenians as well, which is why in 490 BC they sent an expedition across the Aegean Sea and attempted to defeat the Athenians at Marathon, where they were in turn soundly defeated by a Persian army. They were soundly defeated by an Athenian army. It was a great moment in Athenian history. And many Athenians thought this was it. They had succeeded in defeating the largest empire in the world. Indeed, the Persian Empire is the largest empire the world had seen to that date. It's approximately 20% of the population of Earth lived under Persian rule. Here you can see Marathon over here, where the Persians invaded and were pushed back in 490 BC. Many Athenians thought they were now safe, no longer had to worry about a Persian invasion. But there were those in Athens who knew better and knew differently. The Persian king, who we see represented here in a relief from Persepolis, the palace, in the Persian capital, the Persian king had no intention of letting Athens get away with this attack, this defeat of the Persian Empire. The Persian emperor had been Darius at the time, Persian king. He'd been replaced by his son Xerxes, and Xerxes fully intended to come back and strike again. Most Greek city-states were in no position to resist, but two of them did, and two great city-states led the resistance. One, Sparta, and here we see the representation of a Spartan warrior. He's an unknown Spartan warrior. This is a statue that can be seen in the Museum of Sparta today. And the other, Athens, led by a man named Themistocles. Now, if you haven't heard of Themistocles, you should. You should have heard of Themistocles, because Themistocles was one of the great leaders, one of the great military leaders, one of the great statesmen of history, and one of the great leaders of democracy in history. This statue, this bust of him, was discovered in the 1930s outside of Rome. And you can't see it here, but at the bottom it says Themistocles, so we know how to identify him. If you look at him, he has a rather rough-hewn, maybe even bulldog sort of look about him. Themistocles would have liked that. He was proud of the fact that he was not your garden variety aristocrat. He once said, "I may not know how to sing or to play the lyre, but I know how to make a city great and free." And he was as good as his word. He did make Athens great and free. Themistocles was a man of great vision and great foresight. And he understood that the Persians intended to come back. And this time, they would come back to Athens in force. The expedition at Marathon was just a small assault by the Persians. But this time, they would come back with a much larger expedition. Themistocles understood that what the Athenians needed to stop the Persians was a navy. Here you see a coin of the Persians. On the right, you see the Persian king in his chariot. And on the left, you see one of the Persian warships, the triremes, the pride of the Persian fleet, rowed by oarsmen arranged on 3 decks and with a ram in the prow. In order to defeat the Persians, Themistocles knew that the Greeks needed to have a state-of-the-art navy. But how are they going to get it? And how are they going to pay for it? And this is an example of the ship they built, an Athenian trireme. This actually is Olympias. It was built as a result of a magnificent obsession in the 1980s, built by a joint Hellenic-British effort and rode for several seasons in the Aegean. It now sits in an open-air museum in Phaleron. How did the Athenians build a navy? Because navies then, as now, were expensive. Well, in the year 483 BC, there was a great strike of silver in the state-owned silver mines in the south of Attica, here at Lavrium, today in Greece. And Themistocles persuaded the Athenians to use the money to build a navy. There was another proposition to use the money to make distribution to every Athenian citizen, but instead, thanks to Themistocles' foresight and his persuasive abilities, it was used to build a navy. And so the Athenians had 200 ships to launch against the Persians. Other Greek states had ships as well. Corinth, here on the Corinthian Gulf, had an important navy, and so did the island of Aegina here in the Saronic Gulf. Neither Corinth nor Aegina was a friend of Athens, but they decided to unite against the Persians. 31 Greek states led by Sparta formed the opposition. There were hundreds and hundreds of Greek states, but few of them dared to resist Persia. The Persians invaded with a huge navy, over 1,000 ships, and a huge army, 150,000 soldiers approximately, and with a fleet of transport ships to carry supplies and many large numbers of beasts of burden and servants and camp followers servicing the Persians. They marched across the Hellespont. Xerxes actually bridged the Hellespont with a bridge of boats through northern Greece, sailing through a canal he had built specially through the Athos Peninsula, and then they came south. It was in central Greece that the Greeks made their first attempt to stop them. A joint land-sea expedition with the Greek navy led by the Athenians here off the northern end of the island of Evia at Artemisium, and the Greek army led by the Spartans at Thermopylae, the famous Hot Gates. The Battle of Thermopylae is an epic in and of itself. Some of you may have had a taste of it in the movie 300. Others perhaps will have read Herodotus, the great chronicler of this event. It was a magnificent last stand, a doomed one, and famously 300 Spartans fought there, and almost all of them, 298, died, including their king Leonidas. It didn't stop the Persians, but it rallied Greek opposition. Meanwhile, around the same time, in late August of 480 BC, the Greek navy, led by the Athenians, fought the Persians to a standstill off Artemisium. It was the first taste of blood for the new Athenian navy, and it was a tremendous success on their part to be able to do so well against the Persians. They then retreated. They retreated southwards back to Athens. Meanwhile, the Persians headed south themselves, but a large portion of their fleet had been wrecked by a storm off the east coast of the island of Evia. We now come into September of 480 BC. The Greek fleet had relocated itself off Attica, off Athens, on the island of Salamis. It was here that Themistocles wanted to make the final stand, the final naval battle against the Persians. But other Greeks had a different opinion. Here you see another version, another view of Olympias, which we saw before, this trireme that was the pride of the Greek fleet. So, as I said, the Greeks were at Salamis in September of 480. The Persians marched south and they entered Attica, hoping to kill as many men as they could and enslave the women and children. But they were disappointed, because part of Themistocles' plan, his brilliant strategic plan, was to convince the people of Athens, lock, stock, and barrel, to evacuate Athens and to take refuge in various places along the Saronic Gulf and on the island of Salamis. And most of the Athenians followed his advice. Reluctantly, they left their homes and they evacuated Attica. Just a small number stayed and made a fort on the Acropolis, defeated. And the Persians burned the temples on the Acropolis, destroying them in revenge to what the Athenians had done in Sardis, and a great and terrible sight for the Greeks on Salamis, who could see the fires burning in the distance. It was now that Themistocles tried to persuade the Greeks of his plan. If we can get the Persians to take their fleet, and the Persians had The Persians were here at Phaleron and Phaleron Bay. If we can get them to take their fleet and to sail into the Salamis Channel, there we can defeat them. If you notice, the channel is rather narrow compared to the wide open sea. And there the Greeks, who were outnumbered by the Persians, would have a fighting chance. In the open sea, they couldn't fight. They couldn't win at all. Persians still now had about 700 ships. The Greeks had somewhat under 400 ships. The Athenian 200 ships and various allied ships that came from the Greek, that came from the Peloponnesus, that came from Aegina, that came from the Aegean, and one lone ship came from southern Italy to help the Greeks of the East. That was Themistocles' plan, and it was a brilliant plan, but there were two problems. Problem one, the Persians knew how to look at a map as well, or to look at geography, and they understood that there was nothing in it for them to enter the Salamis Narrows. Problem two, the rest of the Greeks got cold feet. They did not want to fight at Salamis. Led by Sparta, and the Spartan admiral Eurybiades was the titular head of the Greek fleet, although Themistocles was its real brains. They wanted to retreat to the Peloponnesus. They were building a wall across the isthmus, and they wanted to stop the Persians there. Themistocles pleaded with them, don't do that. If you do that, the Persians will simply land at various places on harbors on the coast, and they'll go around your wall and make an end run, and they will defeat you. But he could not win the day. And so Themistocles decided to do what he was best at, or one of the things he was very good at. He decided to engage in deception. He would cheat the Persians and trick the Greeks. It would be a perfect double cross. Here is Leonidas in this wonderful 18th century painting by Jacques-Louis David, ready to give his life at Thermopylae. And here is a map showing the progress of the Persians down to Salamis in September of 480. And here we have our friends at Salamis again on the eve of the battle. Themistocles wanting the Persians to enter the channel, but neither the Persians nor the other Greeks being willing to do it. The Themistocles double cross. Spartan commander Eurybiades. Okay, here's Phaleron Bay. Here's where the Persians are located. Themistocles gets a loyal servant, a slave from central Greece named Sikinus. This is an image of a slave from Greek vase painting. We don't have an image of Sikinus. And he sent him in a small boat from Salamis to Phaleron to address the Persian king, Xerxes. And he told Xerxes that Themistocles was ready to betray the Greeks. Themistocles was ready to retreat and to turn over the Greek fleet to the Persians. And he told that was a lie, but what he then said was true, that the Greeks had decided to abandon Salamis, that the very next morning they planned to retreat to the Peloponnesus, leaving the Athenians high and dry. And that was why Themistocles was ready to betray the fleet to the Persians. All the Persians had to do was that very night, they had to sail their ships into the channel to be ready to cut the Greek fleet off at dawn and to prevent their escape. Xerxes thought this was an interesting proposition, and he asked his advisors what to do. One of Xerxes' advisors was one of the most remarkable figures in the annals of military history. Her name was Artemisia. She was the ruler of the city-state of Halicarnassus on the southwest Aegean coast of Anatolia, the modern Turkish city of Bodrum, and first female admiral in history of whom we know. She was the head of her state's contingent. She told Xerxes this was a trap. Don't fall for it. The Greek is lying. Don't let your fleet go into the strait. But Xerxes' other advisors, his Persian advisors, disagreed. They said that this was a perfect opportunity to defeat the Greeks without having to fight a real battle. The Persians love to fight smart. They love to suborn treachery. They've done it before, at Thermopylae, for instance, and this seemed a perfect opportunity. So Xerxes took the bait. He decided to send his fleet into the Salamis Straits that very night. Meanwhile, back on Salamis, the slave gave the message to Themistocles. Before that, though, I just want to show you this slide of a royal woman from Halicarnassus. This was discovered in recent excavations there. And you can see the gold wreath, you can see her jewelry. And one of the rings, I'm afraid I don't have a close-up of these rings, but one of them actually shows a Persian soldier, showing that her loyalties were to the Persian king. Okay, so Sicinnus goes back to Salamis. He tells Themistocles the good news that the Persians are coming. And indeed, the Persians launch their fleet and begin rowing into the Salamis Straits. On the island of Salamis, the Greeks get the news. The Persians are coming. And now Themistocles is able to effect the second half of the double cross. You can't escape. You have to fight. Indeed, the Greeks agreed, and the battle was ready to take place exactly as Themistocles had planned. His grand design to fight a battle in the Salamis Straits was ready to take off. So let's look at what happened on the next day. Let us say September 25th, 480 BC. So here are the Greeks. They have their fleet in these two harbors, modern Ambalaki Bay and Pelukia Bay. They are waiting for the Persians. The Persian fleet has come from Phaleron and sailed in all night long into the strait. When dawn breaks, they're not all there yet. The process is still going on of the Persians coming in. Now, the Persians expected to see a terrified Greek fleet that was planning to escape, but instead, to their surprise, they see a Greek fleet that is ready to do battle, that is armed and ready to fight a battle. This is not what they had expected. The Greeks had spent the night on shore getting ready. They boarded their ships in the pre-dawn hours. The Persians had spent the night at sea, to be sure, not on the high seas, but here in the Salamis. Had to have teams rowing the ships back and forth in order to stabilize them. Not nearly as relaxing as being on dry land. Here we have a view of the straits from where the Greeks would have been. This is looking towards the mainland here, and Mount Aegaleus over here. Okay, let's actually go back. Let's go back. And, okay, Mount Aegaleus. This is an important place because it's on the slopes of this mountain, on the mainland, that Xerxes himself sat on his throne and observed the battle, with servants running down to the shore to see the news from up close, and then running back up to give their king the news. So, the battle begins. The Greeks don't want to fight all at once. In the beginning, they're backing water. And as we'll see in a moment, they have a reason to do that. They have a reason to hold the battle off as long as possible. But eventually, they can hold off no longer, and they begin fighting the Persians. And now we see just how wise Themistocles' planning was. The Persians outnumbered the Greeks, and had they fought on the open water, they could have surrounded them, and they could have effected their favorite maneuvers, ramming the enemy ships on the side or in the quarter. These ships were not capable of prow ramming. They were not sufficiently sturdy to be able to do that. The Greek ships, the Persian ships were also faster than the Greek ships. So had they been on the open sea, they could have out and moved more quickly than the Greek ships. The Greek ships were outnumbered and they were heavier. But suddenly having heavier ships becomes an advantage. Because they're in a narrow space, the Greeks their ships. And so they begin fighting and they win great successes against the Persians. There's another factor, and that is the Greeks had been waiting for the regular morning breeze to blow up. This wasn't a very heavy breeze, maybe 4 to 5 knots. It's called the avra in Greek, or the aura. And when it blew up, the Greeks were prepared for it, the Persians were not. On top of that, the Persian ships were higher in the water than the Greek ships. They rode higher, they had higher decks. The wind caught them, and they were unsettled by this wind. That gave the Greeks an additional advantage in the battle that they were fighting. Here's where we see the two navies. You can see that the Persian navy had the mainland as behind them, and the Greek navy had the island of Salamis behind them. Ancient navies needed to have land behind them in order to have a friendly shore to go to if their boats were rammed and foundered and they needed to swim to safety. And so here the battle took place inside the Salamis Straits, with the Greeks winning. There was another factor. As the Persians start to lose, they want to flee from the straits, but they can't, because there's still Persian ships coming into the strait. Ship after ship after ship is entering the Salamis Straits. And so the Persian navy is caught between the Greek pursuers and their own men, who are making it difficult for them to escape. This map shows King Xerxes sitting on a throne over here. We don't know exactly where he stood, except where he sat, excuse me, but we know that he could see the battle from the distance. And earlier here, we see the Persian navy entering the straits. Here is another view of the straits at its narrowest point. This is on the island of Salamis, modern Salamina, and here is the mainland and the slopes of Mount Aegaleon, where Xerxes was sitting. Here we see a prow of a trireme. This is Olympias, this modern hypothetical reconstruction of what a trireme would look like. You would see that the ram is three-finned. And here, back to the image that we started with, the battle. Now, if you look carefully at this image, you will see there is a female archer here. This is meant to represent Artemisia, because Artemisia played a remarkable role during the battle. So, Herodotus tells us that at one point during the battle, a Greek captain, an Athenian captain, recognized Artemisia's flagship. The Greeks had put a special price on Artemisia's head. They were deeply insulted that a woman would dare to attack the manhood of Greece. And so there was a big price on her head. When this Athenian saw her flagship, he immediately attacked it. But Artemisia was too clever for him. She turned on a friendly ship beside her and she rammed it. Now, Herodotus tells us that this ship was captained by a rival prince of Artemisia and someone who had insulted her earlier in the campaign. And Herodotus suggests that perhaps in doing so, she was trying to get revenge on him. But the other thing that she did was she confused the Athenian. When he saw her ship attacking a Persian ship, the Athenian captain concluded, I must have been wrong. That wasn't Artemisia after all. And so he desists from his attack on her and she escapes. Now, one of Xerxes' men, Xerxes' runners, Xerxes' messengers had been giving him bad news throughout the battle. And Xerxes had ordered that some of his captains be executed for their failure to defeat the Greeks. Finally, one of Xerxes' men saw an opportunity to give him a piece of good news. He knows that Xerxes cannot see clearly what is happening from his position on the mountainside, so he twists the reality a little bit. He gives him fake news. He tells him that he tells Xerxes that Artemisia, that one of his ships, a Persian ship, had rammed and sank a Greek ship. Who is the captain of that ship? Asked Xerxes. And the answer was Artemisia, sire. And supposedly there is a pause, and Xerxes issues the very sexist line of woe. Woe is me! My men have become women, and my women have become men. Make of what you will, make of that what you will. Here's another image of rowers on an Athenian trireme. They were the heroes of this battle. And here a view of a similar thing, a trireme in profile, this looking at the side of Olympias. And here you have a view inside Olympias. Here you have the rowers in one of the summer trials. Kind of looks a bit crowded in there. You get a sense that it would not have been entirely pleasant to be rowing a trireme in battle. And remember that in battle, you would not be able to look out the trireme. There would have been hides put up, animal hides put up to protect the rowers from arrows, to protect the rowers from enemy arrows. Artemisia. This is a jug of Parnassus from this period. It's got the name of Xerxes on it, as if it had been a gift to Artemisia from Xerxes. It's a sense of how close their relationship was. She survives the battle, and Xerxes continues to think highly of her. After all, she had given him the advice. When the day ends, the Greeks have won a complete victory. To top everything else off, Persians did not know how to swim. They considered salt water to be demonic. Greeks did know how to swim. And so many Persians died from drowning in the Salamis Straits. Many of them were killed by Greeks. They had escaped their ships, but Greeks shot arrows at them or even beat some of them with broken oars while they were in the water. We don't have accurate or reliable casualty figures for the battle, but the only figures we have say that the Greeks lost 40 triremes, the Persians lost 200 triremes. That indicated to Xerxes that the war was lost and that he had to return to Persia as quickly as possible. He wasn't just the commander, he was the king. He was the symbolic head of the entire empire. Without a navy to protect him, without a competitive navy to protect him, it was just too risky for him to stay on the Greek mainland. And I must point out that by far the most reliable and efficient form of transportation in this period was naval transportation, not land transportation. So Xerxes, with some of his ships, sails back quickly across the northern Aegean, back to the Hellespont and back to safe territory in Anatolia. Artemisia is entrusted with his sons, who he had brought to the battle, which was customary on the part of the Persians. Now, he left a large Persian army in central Greece under his kinsman, Mardonius. And until that army was defeated the following year, the war was not over. There still was a chance of Persian victory. But in the spring of 479, in the spring of 479, so here is Themistocles again, our friend. In the spring of 479 BC, the Spartans led the Greek army to victory over the Persians at Plataea in central Greece. This is this is taken from an ancient vase. It shows two Greek massed infantry units going into battle. The Battle of Plataea, which was fought here in Boeotia. Around the same time, in the spring of 479 BC, the Athenian navy had sailed across the Aegean, and they defeated the Persians at the Battle of Mycale. That began the liberation of the Greek city-states along the coast of Anatolia, all the way north to the Hellespont, all the way north where the Persians were driven back. That was the end of the Persian invasion of Greece in 480, and it kept Greeks free. Here we have the Spartans. As a result of the victory, subsequent victories at Plataea and Thermopylae, Athens' young democracy was allowed to continue. If the Persians had won, they would have imposed tyrannies or oligarchies up and down the Greek world, ruled by one man or ruled by a few. Instead, Athens remained as a democracy, and ultimately, it built one of the most famous war memorials in history. It built the temple of Athena the Maiden, Athena Parthenos, the Parthenon, which we still see today. This was built by booty collected in war against the Persians, and more controversially, funded by taxes that were imposed on the Greeks of the Aegean, new naval empire that the Athenians built there after defeating the Persians. The good news of the Athenian victory and the Greek victory is that they went on to become history's first great democracy. They were already a democracy. Now they became ever more democratic, and they built this magnificent temple. The bad news, alas, is that they became an imperial democracy, and ultimately, 50 years after the victory at Salamis, they went to war against their former partner, Sparta, in the most devastating internecine war in ancient Greek history, the Peloponnesian War, also one of the most famous wars of history. So the Battle of Salamis opened the way to a golden age, but it was a golden age full of tension and dynamism and contradictions and power. And Athenian power, the power that made Athens so great, also pitted it against Sparta. So there we have it, the Battle of Salamis. Thank you so much, and I would be glad to take any questions.
Barry, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Your talk has surpassed all expectations.
Oh, you're too kind.
And I encourage everyone to read Barry's book, The Battle of Salamis, the naval encounter that saved Greece and Western civilization. It's available from Amazon. And I'm sure his forthcoming book on Actium, which was also another extremely significant naval battle in ancient history, will be equally interesting. We have some time for questions. If you want to ask a question, you go to the Q&A button and type in the question, and I will read it to Barry, and Barry will answer. And provided we do not have too many questions, I hope we'll be able to read most of them, or if not all of them. I've got one question here from Michael Southwood, addressed to Barry. Professor Strauss, your presentation on Salamis is greatly appreciated. Since the publication of your Battle of Salamis in 2004, have you lectured at the US Naval Academy or the Naval War College? In the second edition of Sea Power and Naval History, it is stated, Salamis and its aftermath illustrate clearly the truth of Alfred Thayer Mahn's famous dictum, communications dominate war. Any thoughts on teaching Salamis to naval officers and reading Mahn for sea power analysis? Many thanks.
You're welcome. Well, thank you for that question. I've lectured at both places, and last academic year, I had the singular privilege of being a visiting professor at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. And there I taught a series of elite officers from the Navy and from the various services. I think it's immensely important for our sailors and our soldiers to study history and to study ancient history. Salamis and other ancient naval engagements are full of lessons. As you say, they do illustrate the Mahanian principle of the key importance of communications at sea, but they teach other principles as well, such as surprise and the importance of having a well thought out strategy, not to mention the importance of intelligence and deception in warfare. And finally, they also indicate how important it is to have popular support. Themistocles could never have carried out his strategy without being a brilliant domestic politician who could rally the Athenians to support him. And that's a major part of the story as well.
Barry, we have a question from George Bulow. How long after their defeat at Salamis Xerxes and the Sasanian Empire remain?
So, yes. So Xerxes was actually the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Sasanians, really good that you mentioned them, but they come later. So the Achaemenids remain in power until they're conquered by Alexander. So we might date that to 330 BC, roughly. So they remain in power for another 150 years. And truth to tell, they go on to Greeks a lot of trouble. After Athens crippled in Sicily during the Peloponnesian War. But they never invade Greece again, as they had done in 480-479. The problems they cause rather are through diplomacy, through money, and through getting allies to fight for them, proxies to fight for them in the Eastern Aegean.
Thank you, Barry.
You're welcome.
JB has a question. Is there any source for the battle besides Herodotus?
Yes, there are several sources for the battle besides Herodotus. Herodotus is the greatest source. Herodotus was alive at the time of the battle, but he was only about 5 years old. So we have some contemporary poems, very short ones, and epigrams that were written in memory of those who had fallen in the battle. We have what's left of a long poem that was written about the battle in the later in the 5th century BC by a poet named Timotheus, and we only have so-called fragments of it, little bits and pieces that were found on fragmentary papyrus. We have a universal history written by Diodorus of Sicily around the time of the Emperor Augustus. So we're talking about 450 years later, the Roman Emperor Augustus. And he uses a very important 4th century BC historian, very knowledgeable about naval history, a man named Ephorus. Finally, there's a very important inscription called the Themistocles Decree. This was discovered in a coffee house on the other side of the Saronic Gulf in Troyes by an American archaeologist around 1960, and it was published. And it purports to be the great decree that the Athenians passed at Themistocles' behest before the Battle of Salamis, arranging for the evacuation of Athens and for the manning of the fleet. Does not date to the time of Salamis. Rather, it dates to about 200 years later, and it claims to be based on the original that was first put up around the time of the battle. So very important and interesting source. We do have some archaeological evidence that's not directly relevant to the battle, but indirectly relevant to it as well. So yes, we have all those things. And I guess I should say topography. Many people have studied the topography of the area. And historical reconstruction. From the trials of Olympias, we learn things about ancient fleets. And they're relevant to understanding Salamis as well.
Jonathan Brahms asks, what are the water and air currents like in the Strait of Salamis and the bay or harbor where the battle took place?
That is a good question. I don't know what the air currents are like. The water currents, I think I'm gonna have to pass on that one as well. It's been a while since I have looked at that, other than to say that they weren't a major factor in the battle. The winds, as I mentioned, were far more important.
Maria Lisa Pharmakidis asks, were there any innovations from a naval perspective at the battle that also helped the Greeks win, or any innovations that resulted from lessons learned from the battle? She also thanks you for the talk and looks forward to your book on Actium.
Thank you very much. You're very welcome. I wouldn't say that there were any innovations in the battle. I mean, the key innovation and that Themistocles, as I said, used it to such great effect, And some people have looked at the Battle of Salamis and said, the Greeks must have had a technological advantage. But I don't think they really did. I don't think their triremes were inherently better than the Persian triremes. Of course, the Persians themselves were not a seafaring people, and all of the quote-unquote Persian triremes, they had Persian officers and Persian captains, but they were not crewed by Persians. There were various national contingents. The Egyptian contingent was important. The Carian contingent from Halicarnassus. The Phoenician contingent was very important. And finally, the Greek contingent. There are various Greek subjects of Xerxes who provided ships. But technical innovations, excuse me, no, I wouldn't say that that was a major factor in the battle.
We have a question from Andre Vagliano. Can you talk to us a bit about the extraordinary ability of a democratic politician, Themistocles, to have succeeded in convincing the demos to give up their immediate interests and comforts, endure dreadful suffering in order to defeat the Persians and preserve their way of life?
Wouldn't we like to know the secret sauce that Themistocles used to achieve that? I would suggest a couple of things. For one thing, he had the advantage that the Athenians had actually been attacked by the Persians in their home territory 10 years earlier. That made it very difficult for any Athenians to have any illusions about what awaited them or what was at stake. On top of that, he was a brilliant man, absolutely brilliant. Thucydides, the founder of political science and one of the great minds of the ancient world, said that nobody did better at Themistocles in terms of natural genius or his ability to foresee the future, to tell what's going to happen. Another thing to remember is that this war took place in the shadow of a revolution. Athenian democracy was only 30 years old at the time of the Battle of Salamis. It was a young regime. It was full of energy and enthusiasm about what democracy could achieve and what a free and united people could achieve. And Themistocles was he was immensely clever. He also understood the importance of making coalitions. Themistocles didn't get up and say my way or the highway. Rather, he made deals. He made deals with his enemies, his former enemies. And he got he got some of the leading aristocrats in Athens who were dedicated to fighting using cavalry to win battles, to agree to sponsor warships. These warships were funded by individual wealthy people as well as by the state. So he put together a great coalition. He also used religion. He was adept at using religion. He got the Delphic oracle to support him. And he also got the priests of Athena to support him. The priests of Athena, when people didn't want to leave Athens, the priests of Athena said, the sacred snake of Athena has fled and won't eat. This shows that the goddess herself, the lady of Athens, the patron of Athens, wants everyone to leave. And as far as the Oracle of Delphi, originally when the Athenians had gone to the Oracle and said, the Persians are coming, what should we do? The Oracle said, in effect, you're out of luck. Flee. Flee to the ends of the earth. And Themistocles said, nah, that's not right. We're going to send back another embassy to the Oracle, maybe this time with some more gifts for the Oracle. How about another Oracle? And this time Delphi said, trust to the wooden walls. Trust to the wooden walls. Themistocles was able to work with that. The wooden walls, he said. Well, his enemies said the wooden walls means we have to build a palisade on the Acropolis and make our last stand there. Themistocles said, no. The wooden walls refer to the new fleet which we've built. Trust to the wooden walls of the ships. So he used all these different techniques. And he was a great speaker as well.
We have a lot of questions, and I see that we're now almost at the 1 hour mark. We'll try and take, let's say, 4 more. I think Barry answers very efficiently, but you will forgive us if we don't take all of them. John Stratakis says, thank you for an excellent presentation. Can you elaborate a bit on the state of democracy in Athens before and after the battle? I think you have covered this in some degree, Barry, but you might like to elaborate.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Thank you for your very kind words. So, you know, Athenian democracy began as a, like all Greek regimes, it was based on the fighting men. The men who did the fighting had the direct political power. That's not to say that women didn't have indirect power in Greece. They had a lot of power, especially in religion, but in other ways as well. And that's a story for another question or another day. But so in its early days, Athenian democracy, the balance of power was held by the fighting men in the infantry phalanx. These tended to be of mid-wealth, if not great wealth, and they you couldn't fight in the phalanx unless you provided your own arms and armor, and they were very expensive by the standards of an ancient economy. The difference that comes after Salamis is that Athens is saved by the navy, and the navy is rowed by ordinary men, by poor men. All you needed to row in the fleet was you needed a cushion. That's it. Everything else was provided. So after Salamis, balance of political power shifts to the navy. Athens becomes a naval state, even more so after Salamis than it had been beforehand. It does not go back to being a state that depends on the land army. And this has huge impact on democracy. Democracy becomes more open. It becomes more egalitarian. The poor have political power. And Athenian democracy becomes, from the point of view of elite authors, quote unquote, too radical because it listens to the voice of the poorest people. But the political consequences for democracy of Salamis are absolutely dynamite.
I've got two questions that are related. One from Joyce Vassiliou. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. After the amazing victory, what happened to Themistocles? And the related question from Nicholas Sakellariadis is, was Themistocles involved in a triple cross, not just a double cross? I.e., if the Persians had won, he would have taken credit with the Persian king. And in fact, when he was subsequently ostracized, did he not take refuge in Persia, claiming to be a friend of Persia?
Bravo. Yes, I believe in the triple cross. I believe Themistocles had this in the back of his mind. If the Persians had won, he would have said, yeah, I was on your side all the time. Or if the Greeks had refused to fight at Salamis, I think he would have taken the Athenian fleet and taken as much as he could have and defected to the Persians. Themistocles was always one step ahead of everyone else. But there's no doubt in my mind that his preferred method, his preferred outcome was a Greek victory. Patriot, and he wanted the Greeks to win. Now, after the battle, Themistocles was lionized in Sparta. They thought he was great. They were really grateful for what he had done. But in Athens, well, the Athenian people were jealous of their prerogatives, and there were other politicians who were jealous of Themistocles. Themistocles had a very high opinion of himself. He erected a temple of Artemis of good counsel, Artemis of good advice, in Piraeus, which became Athens harbor thanks to Themistocles, who has it fortified. And there's a statue of himself in this temple. Ultimately, he is exiled. He's the victim of ostracism, a kind of unpopularity contest that existed in Athenian democracy. And he goes from pillar to post in Greece until he finally, there's only one place left where he can go to be safe, and that is to Persia. So Themistocles ends his life as a servant of the Persian king, governing part of the Persian Empire on the Hellespont rather than in Greece. And there's a story that is his descendants, the rest of his family, smuggled his bones back to Athens so they could be buried on his beloved Athenian soil. Also, one story claims that when the Persian king wanted him to attack the Athenians, he committed suicide instead, rather than attacking the Athenians. Great stories.
Barry, I'll just put two together and I think after that I haven't posed, I apologize, but we are at a time limit. These two questions really bear on the engagement or the battle at Artemisium. Michael
Right.
Carlatos asks, how many Greek ships were lost at the battle north of Evia before they moved south? Was this move south a race against the Persian army and navy also heading south? And Costa Kensington, in a related question, asks, some information on the website states the Persians had 1,200 ships. You mentioned the number was 700. Again, which city-states provided the Greek ships? Thanks for the lecture and the book, which I shall look for.
Okay, so great questions. The Persians did have 1,200 ships on their expedition, but they lost large numbers of them in two storms. One near Volos earlier in the campaign, and the other off Evia. The Persians suffered from the Meltemi, the north westerly wind that often blows in the Aegean and in the summer. The Persians had hoped they had hoped simply awe the Greeks into submission through the size of their fleet. Instead, they lose part of their fleet themselves. There are different calculations of how many ships were left, but my own is that about 700 ships were left by the time of the Battle of Salamis. A question about Artemisium, I honestly don't remember how many ships the Greeks lost at Artemisium, but very few. They really did very well at Artemisium. Were they racing back to Athens ahead of the Persians? I'm not sure I'd call it a race, but they weren't dilly-dallying. On the way back to armies move very slowly, so they knew they had some time. Navies move much more rapidly. On their way back, they supposedly carve messages. They leave messages, carve or chalk messages on rocks and on cliff sides to the Ionian Greeks, the Greeks in the Persian Navy. Fight poorly, defect, help your brethren here in Greece. But they certainly made it back to Athens in time to help help ferry the Athenians across the Saronic Gulf to their evacuation.
Well, Barry, thank you for answering all those questions. There's one question that doesn't bear on the book, but it is an interesting question, I think, for the audience, and very quickly.
Sure.
Marianthi Kolakis just asked, what events are being planned in Greece to mark this major anniversary? That's if you know.
Yes, Marianthi. Thank you for that question. There's a wonderful conference that's going to take place in Athens in the beginning of October. It was supposed to be a conference in person, but alas, events prevented that. So we will all be taking part via webinar. It's to mark the anniversary of Thermopylae and Salamis. It's a terrific group of scholars, not just ancient historians, but political scientists and military historians and students of democracy who are going to come, and students of Greek literature who are going to come to these battles and their legacy from many different directions. I am sure there are other events being planned as well, but that's one that I know.
Well, thank you everybody for your questions. There are a few others, but I think we have to close off the questions. But they were all great questions, and we very much appreciate your participation. Nick, I wonder if you would like to say a few words in closing. Nick?
Yeah, let me unmute myself.
Yeah.
Let me just say, this was utterly fascinating. I cannot imagine a better description of the importance of the event. And I have to say, I started reading the book, and it's very hard to put it down. It just almost reads like a novel. It's very inspiring. And thank you very much for taking the time and the effort to educate us all about something that is so important in history for not only the Greeks, but for everyone. But so thank you very much. And Robert, thank you for doing such a wonderful job with the introduction and taking all of the questions. I wish we had actually more time to go through the rest of the questions, because they are all very interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry. Yeah.
You're welcome. Thanks so much
Yeah.
for having me.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.